Welcome, Game Chasers everywhere, to episode 38 of the Collecting Confidant with your host, GunstarHero. Welcome everyone to 2023. Hope you had an amazing holiday and that 2023 brings you all the best, and I wish you all an amazing year. So we are on to the first episode of the year, and we're starting off with a banger. I've been alluding to this the last couple episodes. This is probably one of the greatest gaming compilations ever made and is going to set a new high bar. I mean, I thought the Cowabunga collection had set a high bar. This surpasses it. We are talking about Atari 50, the anniversary celebration, which is now available physically for the PS4, the PS5, Nintendo Switch, and the Xbox One/Series X. But of course, you can also get it digitally on those platforms, including Windows. Again, I've been hyping up this game for a while, and I have to say that there is so much jam-packed in this compilation, from content to design, that the developers Digital Eclipse are clearly the new standard makers, and I hope that other publishers come to them with their back catalogs. I mean, even down to the box art. Look, just the beautiful use of black and gold, the design which runs throughout the game in terms of the user interface and the overall just slickness to it, and how well the games have been emulated. I can't speak enough of this, especially at the wonderful price point of $39.99 US for the physical platforms. You can't beat that in terms of value. So let's get into the compilation and what makes this so special. And then after I do that, we're going to do a top 10 rundown of my favorite games in the compilation, because there are exactly 103 games in this compilation across 8 different eras. We're talking about a lot of jam-packed content. So of course you have the reimagined era. There's 6 brand new games for 2022 in here, from Neo Breakout to Yar'S Revenge Reimagined. You've got Quadratank, based off the old combat game. You also have Haunted Houses, which is like a 3D over-the-shoulder reimagining of the old classic from 2600. And then on top of that, for all you Sword Quest fans, you're finally going to get Air World, which is the 4th title in the series that was never released on 2600, in addition to the previous 3 iterations. So now for any of you fans of that classic, now you got the whole series here at your fingertips. So I think that's outstanding. And in addition, the reimagined era includes a digitized version of the old Touch Me portable game, where you would basically repeat sequences by pressing buttons, and was a predecessor to the very popular toy Simon that came out way back. So you've got those as part of the reimagined era, but then you also have other eras like the Atari 2600, which is well represented here with many different games. You've also got the Atari 5200, the 7800. You've got a few titles from the Atari 800 PC, and then on top of that, Atari's portable link system, and for the first time ever on modern consoles, Atari Jaguar, the 64-bit competitor to the 32-bit era, finally in all its glory on this compilation. 103 games total, 5 of which are unlockable, and it's actually really cool because when you go on the timeline of the selectable games, the ones that are unlockable will be listed as classified documents with a little riddle on how to unlock them. So that is really cool from a historical perspective, and there's so much to dive into and something for everybody. Now, what's inevitably going to happen in a compilation like this, of this size, with so many titles to choose from, is that not every title is going to be here. And Digital Eclipse, I did watch some interviews with them. They did address this, and they said, you know what? We could have gone 2 ways. We could have either A, just put in hundreds of titles and tried to represent everything, but we feel that would have been a little too much, and probably would have resulted in just kind of like not knowing what to play, right? Whereas they decided to go with a museum-like curated approach, and they said from the outset that they wanted to go bigger and better than their previous compilations, because they're famous for the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary compilation, the SNK 40th Anniversary, and of course the recently released Cowabunga collection for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So they've already made their bones in terms of making exceptionally great compilations, but they wanted to go even higher, and they said they wanted to set a new standard that other developers and publishers would have to adhere to going forward in terms of just quality and presentation, and having this interactive / integrated museum-like experience where literally you can go into 5 separate timelines based on the eras, and it's so slickly presented. You have this horizontal timeline with all these different points of interest from year to year. So, for example, if you go into the 70s, you'll be able to learn about Pong or asteroids. And then if you want to go deeper dive into any one of these topics, you can go vertically down the timeline and discover scans of old promotional materials, video captures of old TV spots, interviews with the developers, and then on top of that, you can launch specific games from the timeline. So if you're learning about a specific game and you want to try it in the context of what you're learning, you can jump in and out of it and then go on to a different subject. They said that this wasn't only meant to just appeal to the hardcore Atari audience, but to people like myself who are more casual. I'm going to tell you right now, I was born in the 80s, but I was too young for the Atari. My experience with the 2600 was usually with cousins or older family members who had those, but I never had one of my own. I was more of an NES Genesis kid. That was my era. So nostalgia-wise, Atari doesn't really speak to me other than the few arcade games I played over the years, but having gone through everything on this timeline, I 100%ed the whole thing. I will encourage you to actually 100% all 5 timelines. You can actually track your progress, and if you do 100% them, there is a little secret that you'll unlock at the end, which is totally worth doing, so definitely do it. From an options perspective, every game has standard options like, for example, remappable controls. You can choose whether you want the original aspect ratio or full screen or widescreen. And then you can also choose whether to turn the TV filter on or off. Now, I'll tell you, in most retro compilations, I typically don't turn on CRT filters or scan lines, but the way they've done it in this is so vivid, beautiful, and accurate. I'll give you the best example. When you go to play Pong, if you actually play it with the borders on, which you can also turn and choose off, the original arcade borders, I highly recommend playing it with borders on and the TV filter. You'll see the warping of the screen, and it actually makes you feel like you're playing an original Pong arcade game. So I'd say, again, from design, I'm not usually impressed by that kind of stuff, but they really blew me away with this. Then, on top of that, certain games are going to have game-specific options as well. So, for example, if you're playing an arcade game, in the options menu, you'll actually have a way to look at a scanned copy of the original arcade flyer that was used to sell to vendors. Or if you're playing a console game, you'll actually be able to see a scanned version of the instruction manual. And on top of that, some games, like, for example, Asteroids, being a vector game, has a glow meter where you can choose how much of a glow you want. Then other games like, for example, the classic Star Raiders for the Atari 5200. Yes, people, Star Raiders is here. And they actually have an enhanced mode that you can turn on or off, because if you recall, Star Raiders back in the day had some frame rate issues and didn't always perform the best. Well, they left that intact, but also have an enhanced mode that if you want to play it at a smooth 30 frames per second and play it in the modern era, you can do so. So Digital Eclipse is so good at those little details that other people don't pick up on, because you can tell they are fans of the subject material. And they said, because we love this material so much, it encouraged us to put that extra time to go above and beyond. And that's where I want to touch a little bit upon the development of this game, because it was very interesting and really gives me more insight into how these retro compilations are emulated and come about. And also kind of answers the critics of Digital Eclipse's previous work. Like, for example, I know that some people were critical of the Mega Man Legacy Collection in terms of some lag and all that stuff. They really got into a lot of the challenges they had to face when emulating multiple different eras of not only Atari games, but different control methods and platforms. And one of the biggest challenges they faced was doing the Atari Jaguar. And that would actually kind of give you some insight into why it took so long for us to see it finally hit modern consoles, because the way they explain it in the interview was that the Atari Jaguar for its time was very powerful, but also had a very complicated internal system that kind of made it very hard to develop for and also emulate. So it was very tricky to get a lot of these games running, but they persisted, made it happen. And it was also interesting in the fact that they said that if we had just emulated these games outright and done no work, these old Jaguar games would actually play too fast. So they actually had to make the emulator work worse in certain scenarios to match any dips in hardware performance. And again, that came about when they tried to do Star Raiders for the 5200, running to frame rate issues. They actually had to tweak the emulator with like a frame rate mode to get it to run the way you would have experienced it on a 5200. So I just think that's wonderful. And then on top of that, the controls. So if you recall, all these different games in the arcades and on the consoles where they had trackballs, they would have paddles, they'd have joysticks, and all these different controllers would have a different feel. And this was very important to them in terms of capturing the feel of all these games. What it would be like to play Missile Command with a trackball. What it would be like to play Pong with the spinner. What it would feel like to play an Atari Jaguar game with that giant numeric keypad. And they're essentially able to pull it off because they went into every game, made sure it felt a certain way, and I think you're really going to enjoy the results. So I just can't go on enough about how great this compilation is. There are so many wonderful, timeless games here, and I thought that to keep this video at a relatively normal time frame, I thought I'd pick my top 10 favorite games out of the whole compilation, even though it doesn't even come close to covering it. And I will say from the outset that I did not include Tempest 2000 on the Jaguar here, already because I covered it in the last video for the Solar Report, so I thought that'd be a little redundant. So instead I wanted to talk about 10 different games to give you some historical context and what games I think you should dip into first. So let's begin. Let's start with number 10 on the list. This one is Yoomp, which came out for the Atari 800 in 2007. Yes, I said that right, 2007. This was made by a small Polish team and is a great example of what developers can do when they make new games for old hardware using modern methodology. And this game is exceptional, such a technical powerhouse. And what's funny about it is that if you actually buy the physical version, if you can still find one, it will actually function on your old Atari 800. It was made specifically for that, but of course you can get it in all its glory in this compilation. Very simply, this is a 3D, somewhat tunnel jumper where you control a bouncing ball that spins around this tunnel. You have to bounce onto certain tiles to get point bonuses and also avoid the black tiles, which will have you falling into the abyss. And the bounces coordinate with the soundtrack. It just looks very pretty. The soundtrack's amazing for the hardware it was built on. And I'm not usually a fan of making new games for old hardware, but this one really stood out to me. It was a lot of fun and addictive, and I highly recommend trying this out, especially if you're an older person and actually remember playing the Atari 800. I think this is going to blow you away in terms of what was capable on that old hardware. You got to check this one out. On to number 9. Next up, we're going to be going to the Atari 7800. This is a late life title for the system that was released 1 year before the console's demise. It's known as Ninja Golf, which came out in 1990. It was developed by Blue Sky Software, who would later go on to make some of the NFL football games for the Sega Genesis, and of course, one of my all-time favorite sports games, World Series Baseball. This is one of their earlier games, and this is just such an out of left field, quirky mashup of ninja games and golf. Just like the title says, you start off on a golf green, you play as a ninja, you hit your ball, and then wherever it lands, you have to run to it for the next shot. But as you're running to it, you're going to be fighting enemy ninjas with kicks and shuriken. You'll also be facing off against gophers that are throwing mud at you. And then it gets even cooler because let's say you have to run through a sand trap. You'll all of a sudden be in the middle of a desert fighting snakes, or let's say you go through a water hazard, you've got to fight sharks. I thought this was hilarious, but the game mechanics actually work really well. Blue Sky was a very talented developer, and then even better is when you get closer and closer to the tee, once you actually land on the green, you'll actually have to fight a dragon as the boss in order to sink your ball, and it's kind of like a shinobi style thing where you throw shuriken at it. This game, yeah, it gets a little repetitive, but just the quirky nature of it, and it just plays so fun. I have to recommend this for a good hoot. It is so cool. It's really great. Now, on to number 8 on the list. Cybermorph for the Atari Jaguar, which came out in 1993, and this initially was a pack-in for every Atari Jaguar console that came out at launch. Now, this is an example of early semi-open world 3D polygonal shooter, and for the time, it was kind of a graphics powerhouse. I was actually pretty jealous of this game, and I kind of wanted a Jaguar, but my gut was telling me that it probably wasn't going to last, so I kind of held off and stuck to Sega and Nintendo devices. But this game is really ahead of its time. It's a very simple concept. Like, there's this intergalactic war, and you're piloting this spacecraft where you have to go around and shoot the alien forces who have trapped all of your resources and secrets into these pods, which you have to go and collect. And as you collect them, you'll be able to fight back against the alien forces. And you have this green face in the corner of this woman who is your onboard AI, known as the name of Skylar, who will be constantly telling you not to hit the ground and giving you all these warnings. But the reason why I love this game so much is that you can pick which starting stage you go to. The shooting mechanics are very fluid. There's all these different viewpoints you can do, all these different gun types, and the shooting and the collecting just feels really great. And is again an example of what Digital Eclipse meant when they said we didn't always just include the best games. We also included some mediocre games and some bad games. And I wouldn't call Cybermorph a bad game. It has its problems, but it's also ahead of its time in terms of what it would establish for 3D, polygonal, semi-open to open world based environments. And it's a very great early example of that. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to give a lot of examples of games that were important to history, things that established new trends, new innovations, and this is definitely one of them. And the fact that it's a Jaguar game for the first time on consoles, this is such a great treat. You need to play this one, and it's a lot of fun. On to number 7, we're moving on to the Atari Lynx this time with Turbo Sub out of 1991. And out of all the Atari Lynx games on the compilation, this was my favorite. It's again kind of like Ninja Golf, a mashup of two disparate themes. You've got a first-person submarine-based shooter where you're fending off alien attacks in the 28th century. And I just thought that for a portable game, this would have been a lot of fun to play on the Lynx back in the day, especially this came out in the Game Boy era. So the fact that you had like a full color-based portable system was truly amazing back in the day. I think that this would have been one of those killer apps for it where it just feels really great to play the shooting of the aliens, and then of course you can dive underwater when the game tells you to collect these power gems, which are later used as currency to buy upgrades for your ship, extra ammo and fuel. And again, like many of the games, very simple concept, but addictive, well executed, and looks really great for the era. So I definitely recommend out of the Lynx games, this is one of the shining stars out of that era. On to number 6 on the list. This one was a very simple game, but again, was very important for the fact that it highlights the fact that Atari boasted some of the first female game developers in history, and this one was no exception. This one was called Quantum, which came out in arcades in 1982 and was designed by Harvard grad Betty Ryan. It has the distinction of being Atari's only game that used a trackball with vector graphics, but also was one of the few titles that was completely non-violent in nature. And very simply, the concept is you use the trackball, or in this case, your analog joystick, to draw little lines around subatomic particles, and as you do that, you'll eliminate them from attacking you. But of course, if your line collides with one of the particles, you'll end up losing a life. Very simple concept, but I just love the addictive gameplay. And what's really cool is that if you actually get the highest score on this, you can actually sign your autograph to go next to your initials. So very cool, ahead of its time. And I love the vector-based graphics games. And this was one of my favorites on the compilation. So that was number 6. All right, now we're into the top 5. So moving on to number 5, this is a multiplayer game that I found a lot of fun. This was Warlords, which came out in arcades in 1980, and then for the Atari 2600 home port in 1981. Interestingly, the arcade version, which came out first, was actually a port of the 2600 version, but came out first because the Atari 2600 version ended up getting delayed. So it's kind of confusing from a historical standpoint, but both versions are great in their own right. I, of course, prefer the arcade version, which looks a little bit prettier because it has this hand-drawn background that was used in the arcades as a mirror to give it like a three-dimensional view. And all it is, it's basically a mashup of Breakout and Quadrupong, where you have 4 castles in each corner surrounded by a brick wall. And what you're doing is you're using your paddle to deflect a fireball that is used to destroy the walls of the other bases to end up destroying their core. And that's essentially the game. It's kind of like Quadrupong meets Breakout. Very addictive, very fun. I didn't get to play this with multiple players, but I can imagine it'd be really great. And I just think is one of the better multiplayer games on this compilation. Lots of fun. You gotta try it out. It's fast, frenetic, and it really holds up after all these years. Then, moving on to number 4, we get into one of the very few canceled games on this compilation. Yes, another reason why this game is so amazing is they were able to bring out a bunch of canceled games that are either in prototype mode or have never been released to the public. This was one of the best of the canceled games, if not one of the best games on the compilation. I can't believe they never released this. This was Aka-R, which was a trackball-based game that took a lot of cues from Missile Command. When you start the game, you're on this multicolored sector-based battlefield where you operate this cannon in the middle of the field and you shoot out missiles one by one to the different sectors to defend against swarms of alien invaders. But if you miss the swarms and they get closer and closer to your cannon, all of a sudden you'll get a zoom warning where you press the zoom button, and then you'll get a close-up view of your cannon in the middle, where now instead of shooting one-off missiles, you'll have a reticle with rapid-fire attacks where you can use to target all the enemies before they destroy your shields. Very simple concept, but I love the use of the color and the zooming in and out effect. And I just, again, can't believe they never released this. I found myself spending a lot of time with this game. I progressed really far, and it is so addictive. This is one of the standouts of the compilation, and I'm glad that people finally get to play it in all of its arcade glory. Better late than never, I have to say. All right, here we go. Top 3. My third out of 10. This is one I slapped myself because I never played it until now, and this is considered to be one of the greatest games of the Atari 2600 generation. This, of course, is the brilliant Yar'S Revenge, which came out in 1982. It was developed by Howard Scott Warshaw, and I love the fact that they're giving so much love and reverence to this title because, of course, Howard Scott Warshaw would also go on to make the infamous E.T., the extraterrestrial for the 2600, which was unfortunately made in just a few weeks. That was not his fault. He was given a very short deadline and became known as one of the worst games in history and contributed in a way to the great video game crash of 1983. But thankfully, we get to see one of the greatest works he ever did, which was Yar'S Revenge. And it's just such a simple concept. You control this little space insect called a Yar, and there's this enemy Kotile on the right-hand side of the screen that's protected by this shield that is made up of individual cells. And in between you and the Kotile is this Technicolor pulsating neutral zone that you can go into and out of when you need to avoid the enemy destroyer missiles. But the only thing is, when you're inside that neutral zone, you can't shoot away at the shield. So the whole object is you're supposed to be chipping away at this shield and opening up a path to be able to destroy the Kotile using your Zarlon cannon. And the way you do this is you either shoot away the cells, or you can even eat the cells. And when you eat the cells, this will actually activate the Zarlon cannon to ready to fire. And the other way you can activate the Zarlon cannon is if you go in and touch the Kotile itself with your ship. This will activate the Zarlon cannon, ready to fire, and when you hit the fire button, it's going to shoot this giant missile that is supposed to destroy the Kotile. The only thing is, as soon as you hit fire, you need to get out of the way quick, because if you're in the line of fire, you'll also get destroyed by this giant cannon, and if you end up destroying the Kotile, all of a sudden this big psychedelic effect will happen on screen, and you go into the next stage. This game, the sequence and chain of events is such brilliant, understated game design. I can't gush enough about how great this game is and how classic it is. And thankfully, in the Reimagine section, we also get a modern update of Yar'S Revenge that retains all the elements, just simply gives it new updated visuals, a techno score, and just really adds more psychedelia to it. So Yar'S Revenge, once you understand the concept of how to play it, I challenge you to put it down. It is that great. And again, one of the standout hallmark moments of the Atari 2600. So glad it was included here. Now on to number 2 out of 10. This one is one of my favorite of the Reimagined Legacy collection. This one just takes the best aspects of all the great Vector games and mashes them into this new modern masterpiece. Of course, this is Vector Sector, which came out this year, brand new for the compilation. And essentially, you start off doing asteroids, but just in nice, crisp, modern HD visuals with beautiful particle effects and a great soundtrack. But as soon as you finish that first level, boom, you're into Lunar Lander, like a seamless transition. So it's just so fantastic how the scenes meld together. Once, of course, you finish Lunar Lander, then you go into a spin-off of Major Havoc, another one of my honorable mentions for this wonderful Atari 50 collection. So you get into that over-the-shoulder, third-person, high-speed octane, dodging walls, shooting aliens, and then finally, when you're finished with all that, you go into one of my personal favorites, Tempest. So the flow is just beautiful. The graphics are great. I love the pacing of this, and this is truly a modern masterpiece and lends credo to my thought that I'm relieved that Atari is showing their colors. They're showing that they're still here, and they're still putting out some great output as small as it may be compared to their competitors, they're not going anywhere, and this is a great sign of the future to come. So I highly regard this one. That's my number 2. And then finally, number 1, the best thing I played on here that it's not news to anybody, but just stands the test of time. Missile Command out of 1980, and we have several versions on this compilation so you can trace the evolution of this wonderful title. This was an overtly political statement against the Cold War. This came out in the middle of the Cold War, and the designer, Dave Thurr, who also developed the brilliant Tempest, admitted that he actually had nightmares about a nuclear holocaust while developing this game. And essentially, all you're doing is you're controlling 3 different command bases that are attached to 3 different buttons. You're trying to defend 6 different American cities from nuclear holocaust. And what you're doing is you're shooting anti-ballistic missiles against the incoming ballistic missiles and cruise missiles that are coming from the sky. You shoot them, create these little patches in the sky that end up killing the missiles. It's such a simple concept, but so addictive. Pinpoint accuracy, and it even has this ominous ending that when you die, instead of saying game over, it says the end. So again, trying to make this political statement, which interestingly was watered down the year later in the Atari 2600 release, which instead of being about the Cold War in the United States, ends up being about this war between alien races. And then when you get into the 2600 and 5200 versions, which are also on this compilation, you go from having 3 cannons down to 1, but doesn't matter. The ports are still beautiful to play. And then over time, they started reincorporating some of the elements that were lost from the arcade version, which you'll get more of when you move into the Atari Lynx, when you play Super Missile Command, and then eventually when you play Missile Command 3D for the Atari Jaguar, which not only includes the full arcade game in its original glory, but then also a 3D version of it. But then not only on top of that, for you historical buffs who remember that there was supposed to be an Atari Jaguar VR headset that was never released, you've got a VR mode on Missile Command 3D that gives you a glimpse into what VR games were intended to be on the Atari Jaguar. I love Missile Command. Such a great game. I spent so much time with this, but there are just so many classic titles that a top 10 list does not do this compilation justice. I highly recommend this. Even if you are not an Atari fan, you will learn so much about this and the context of why they included certain games on this and why they're so important. What a wonderful slice of history for a great price tag of $39.99 US, which of course is available physically for the PS4, PS5, Switch, and Xbox One/Series X from all major retailers. You've got to get this one for your collection. This has been a jam-packed episode 38 of The Collecting Confidant with your host GunstarHero. Make sure you like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one, and happy 2023. All the best for the year. Peace.